Hello everyone, welcome to the News Desk. Rich Hagan alongside Pro Tour Hall of Famer Luis Scott-Vargas. Luis, let's get to it. We're going to talk about the Kaladesh draft archetypes between now and round number 2. So let's start off with the color pairs that naturally link together, the friendly pairs. We can show you all 10 of them just to give you an overall guide for what you're going to see, because they all have their own little themes. If we show you those, white-blue you see, that's Blink. Blue-black, Artifact Control, Artifact Aggro for black-red, Energy Aggro, red-green, Tokens, green-white, and then the enemy color pairs, white-black is Artifact Recursion, blue-red, Energy Artifacts, black-green, +1/+1 counters, the vehicles for red-white, and finally Energy Ramp for green-blue. So let's kick things off, Luis, with white-blue. Blink, what do we mean by Blink? Here's a look.
So when we say Blink, we mean an effect that exiles a creature and then brings it right back, something like Acrobatic Maneuver, or in this case, even something like Aviary Mechanic, which will return a card to your hand. You can then replay it. So the blue-white deck here is trying to stack creatures with enter the battlefield abilities and then ways to recur those creatures. So like, Experimental Aviator is a perfect example. By itself, 5 mana for 2/5 worth of stats, not super exciting. Once you start, doing some acrobatic maneuvering, then all of a sudden you just have an army of Thopters.
Right, so it is all about enters the battlefield triggers. That's what we're looking for, because in general, blinking itself is, blinking a Windrake doesn't generally do an awful lot.
No, it can dodge a removal spell. Maybe
Right.
you block their creature and blink. But yes, for the most part, you really want the enter the battlefield abilities.
Now, I know that Cloud Blazer is super important just because it's a great card. What else are we looking for to sort of tug us towards white-blue?
So besides something like a Cloud Blazer, which is just a high-quality card, you do want Acrobatic Maneuver. Either Trade Winds is important, Aviary Mechanic. You've got a lot of these effects that give you an advantage when you blink one of your creatures and give you ways to do so. Fabricate creatures like Visionary Augmenter or something like Propeller Pioneer.
Right, and even Glint Sleeve Artisan, something like that, which is a very vanilla, just pretty ordinary fabricate thing. It's always nice just to have that extra body along. And maybe if you know that you're setting yourself up for the blink, you bring it along, you bring a servo along to do a block, and then next time round, well, you turn the Glint Sleeve Artisan back into a 3/3 for real. So, yeah, lots going on there.
Tons of options.
Complicated deck to play?
It certainly can be, and it's actually really hard to play against, because when they have all their mana up, you just never know what kind of tricks they can have and what kind of shenanigans they're up to.
Yeah. Or as we say, Sheena Giggins. So that's white-blue. Let's move on to blue-black. That's our next color pair, and this is Artifact Control. What's going on here, Luis?
So there's a bunch of different black creatures that care if you have artifacts in play. Cards like Doomed Operative, for example. You have blue cards that care about if you have artifacts in play. Gear Seeker Serpent being by far the most prominent. And then a lot of ways to stack up little trinkets, artifacts here and there. You've got your Inventor's Goggles, your Metal Spinner's Puzzle Knots, and cards like that.
I want to ask you about Gear Seeker Serpent. It's a card that I haven't figured out, because I'm well aware it's very good, but because it's so expensive, at least as printed on the card, you don't end up hoovering them all up. You mentioned when you were covering Palestro that there were like 4 or 5 floating around the table. So it's not like you can bring them all to yourself, and that means that other people are in on this plan and looking to that. Do you see that there are multiple drafters at tables because of the Serpent and the fact that you can't kind of corner the market in that?
It can certainly happen. Like the blue-white blink deck we just talked about often will want Serpent if you're pretty high on Fabricate. If you Fabricate twice then play a 5-mana Serpent, that's a great deal. Serpent doesn't need to cost 3 to be good. Just a reduction of 2 is already enough.
5/6 unblockable at
right.
5.
It's just a very powerful card.
Really, really nice. Again, how do you rate the archetype in terms of how complex it is to draft, how complex it is to play?
It's somewhat complex in that it is a control deck. You are trying to get a complicated board going, but the cards are pretty straightforward. They ask you to have artifacts. They get better if you have artifacts. You should probably play some artifacts.
Okay, I think I can take that away quite happily. Next up, let's go to Aggro land. It's Artifact Aggro. Black-red is the color pair. Now, we talked this morning about Unlicensed Disintegration as being a great kickoff to this, but what happens from there?
You're trying to curve out. Renegade Freighter is especially good in decks like this, especially since it's also an artifact that tends to stay in play. Cards like Weldfast Monitor and Doomed Operative are important. You've got these aggressively themed black and red cards that have this sub-theme of caring about artifacts. Your Salivating Gremlins can sometimes make an appearance, and you're trying to beat your opponent down. A really cool part about this deck is that it also segues into black-red control quite nicely. You up the curve a little bit, you add a Welding Sparks, and all of a sudden you're kind of controlling the game. Yeah, Self-Assembler, very important in this archetype as well.
Okay, Self-Assembler, the 4/4 for 5 mana that lets you search out another Self-Assembler, and then if you're really living the dream, a third Self-Assembler as things go along. Now, black-red is a great point in time to pause and ask you about the number of lands in the format, because the black-red aggressive deck can easily be playing 15, and I've certainly seen 3-0 decks in black-red with only 14, but that's unusual.
If you want to do that, then you're actually leaning a little bit away from the artifact part of the deck and just playing Night Market Lookouts and Giant Spectacles and just, yeah, your curve stops at 2 or 3.
And you're playing as many Inventor's Goggles as you can find.
Most certainly, but most decks, I would say, play 16 or 17 lands in the red-black decks, but they're one of the few decks that can really just, like, the curve can just plummet.
Okay, let's carry on with aggressive deck. It's energy aggro, and it's red-green. Now, Voltaic Brawler was the signature uncommon that gets you going in this. What else are we looking for here?
Long Tusk Cub, actually, as we see, is one of the most powerful cards. This is actually one of the better cards in the entire set. You have other energy cards like Thriving Rhino and Thriving Grubs, and you're kind of using red for cards like Welding Sparks, Built to Smash, and some of the uncommons. So it is tends to be a heavier green deck than it does a red deck, but you really want a bunch of cards that use energy and in an aggressive fashion. You're not an energy control deck.
I was looking through some of the data coming out of Magic Online over the last few days. Our good friends at Wizards gave us a sneak peek at what's going on there. It is very noticeable that for all the non-green archetypes, the balance in terms of top picks is pretty even between the two colors. In the 4 green X archetypes, green is the dominant color, very definitely.
Yeah, that doesn't surprise me. Green, I think, is the deepest and strongest color, so most of the green decks are going to be like closer to 60 or 70% green rather than the 50-50 split that we would expect in most color pairs.
And that's well known in this room, right?
Oh, yeah.
You would expect that pretty much everyone would arrive at the Pro Tour with that sense?
I think if you polled the entire population of the Pro Tour and asked what's the best color, green would win in a landslide.
Yep. All right, so next up, it's green-white. This is our 5th of the friendly color pairs, and green-white tokens. It trips off the tongue. We've seen plenty of green-white tokens decks in the past, in Constructed as well. But are we really playing a deck where Inspired Charge is good news?
Oh, definitely. Going wide is the common parlance, and the green-white decks do go wide. They want Inspired Charge. They're actively seeking it out, and sometimes you'll see decks playing 2, 3, even 4, which is convenient because most everyone else at the table doesn't want Inspired Charge.
Right.
Even the white drafters, like white-blue's just not going to put that card in their deck. Mm-hmm. So it uses Fabricate cards to make a bunch of servos and just attack your opponent with 7 creatures, cast Inspired Charge, and that frequently will either win you the game or knock your opponent down to 2, and they try to trade real cards for your servos.
And it's interesting also that we think of tokens as automatically being 1/1s, of course, but at the top end of the green, you have Pima Outrider that has trample, you have Arborback Stomper that has trample, you have Riparian Tiger, which becomes a trampler. So if you are eventually going, here's an Inspired Charge, they don't get to put little things in the way. Those extra points do frequently trample through.
Definitely, and all the Fabricate creatures, if your going wide plan doesn't work, you can just play them as larger creatures. You can all of a sudden play your 4/4s or your Glint Sleeve Artisans as 3/3s and then attack your opponent with real creatures. You're not going all in on the token plan against someone who, say, has Make Obsolete.
Right, I mean, Long Tusk Cub at 2 and then a Glint Sleeve Artisan at 3 is a 3/3 and a 4/4 Trampler Pima Outrider at 4. Hey, never mind tokens, just here's my curve, and
exactly.
It's right on time. All right, let's go to our color pairs that are opposite. So white-black is up next, and this is Artifact Recursion. Well, that means Restoration Gearsmith, and this is, you do feel very rude when you're playing Restoration Gearsmith effectively.
Oh, Restoration Gearsmith is one of the best cards for this archetype in general, and one of the reasons to be in the archetype. And cards like that do pair well with Acrobatic Maneuver and Aviary Mechanic. You've got ways to bring back your artifacts. You've got ways to get an advantage over the long game. One of the keys with this archetype as well, it's kind of like red-black, where you can actually draft a low-curve white-black deck that makes a bunch of servos and then puts Inspired Charge in their deck, and all of a sudden you've got a white-black aggressive deck.
I want to ask you about a card that was on the screen there a moment ago, Eliminate the Competition. There's a lot of, not confusion, but I don't think people really understand how good mass removal is or is not in Limited. What is your sense of a card like Eliminate the Competition?
That card's hard to use, but very, very good in the decks that use it well. White-black is the best way to eliminate the competition, and if you can make servos, you can all of a sudden kill your opponent's like 7 or 8 mana worth of creatures for 5 mana, and you kind of spent 1.25 cards for their 3.
Right. Okay, so good, but with the sort of star next to it.
You can't just throw it in a deck and expect it to work.
If I'm black, I'm not treating it as, look at that. Whereas if I'm black-white, a fumigate, I'm always going to be thinking, fantastic.
Exactly.
Okay, let's move on. Let's take a look at blue-red up next. So this is about energy and artifacts. We've talked about Whirler Virtuoso earlier in the show as being a fantastic card. Why is that card so good? Because we should explain what that is and does.
So Whirler Virtuoso gives you 3 energy and then has the ability, you can spend 3 energy to make a Thopter, a 1/1 flying artifact creature. The reason Whirler Virtuoso is such a prized card is that it's one of the best energy sinks in the format, because 1/1 flyers are great, and it doesn't cost any mana, it just costs energy. So you can combine Whirler Virtuoso with cards like Era of Innovation, cards like Decoction Module, and all of a sudden you can just make an army of Thopters. It's a splashable card. You often see it splashed in something like blue-green or even blue-white, and it's just a really, really powerful card. By itself, it's 3/4 worth of stats, one of which has flying for 3 mana.
We are more than halfway through our set of 10 archetypes, so now is a good point to ask you about this. A lot of the cards we're highlighting are creatures. A lot of the cards we are not highlighting are removal spells. Welding Sparks is on our high priority list for blue-red, but that's relatively rare. Most of the cards we're talking about have power and toughness. Is that unusual in this set? It just seems like we're not prioritizing removal that highly when we talk about the archetypes.
Well, one reason to do that is that Welding Sparks isn't an archetype-specific card. All of the red decks are just going to take the card, play it, and be happy with it.
Right.
So a good, effective way to kind of draw distinctions between the archetypes is to look at what does white want that black-red doesn't want.
Only belongs there.
Right, whereas Tidy Conclusion just fits very nicely in both those.
And Harness Lightning, anyone with mountains says, I'll play Harness
Sometimes people without mountains, they just put it in your green deck, and it's a great card.
Okay, fine, fair enough. So that's blue-red energy artifacts. Black-green is up next, and for this, we want to talk about +1/+1 counters, and you want to overwhelm your opponents with large creatures. And I got to say, Armorcraft Judge is on screen there, Luis. I love that card.
Armorcraft Judge is probably the best card for this archetype that isn't a rare. Maybe Long Tusk Cub makes a little bit of an appearance there too, but Armorcraft Judge frequently draws 2 to 3 cards for 4 mana and is a 3/3. It's just an amazing card.
Yep. So black-green, how solid an archetype, how tough to do? Is it pretty rare and uncommon dependent? Do you need some very specific cards? And because I see Bristling Hydra and I'm like, yeah, I'm in, great.
Yeah, sure, that's just a great card. Black-green isn't as uncommon dependent as something like blue-red. You can draft a black-green deck with mostly commons. You'll want 1 or 2 of the uncommons to really make the deck tick, but black and green both just have a lot of solid cards.
All right, so next up, let's go back to the aggro side of things, kind of. It's red, white, and it's vehicles we want to talk about. So the big, new, splashy class of permanent, I guess, here in Kaladesh. What's going on with vehicles?
So the red-white deck is using a good curve and a lot of combat tricks to push through vehicles and other aggressive creatures. One of the keys to drafting red-white is that you don't actually end up with that many vehicle-specific synergies, so you're more worried about your overall curve and whether you have enough built to smash and built to last to punch through. Though Renegade Freighter and Skyskiff do fit perfectly in the deck.
Have people figured out vehicles? Have they worked out how many you want to draft, how many you want to play, how badly you want to kill them, how you need to crew them? Or is that very much a space that the Magic world has to come in the next sort of few weeks?
I think people have a pretty good handle on it. A good rule of thumb is the Crew 1 and Crew 2 vehicles fit very nicely in almost any deck. They're pretty easy to run. Crew 3 is, you actually have to build around it. Crew 4 and 5 is a little bit more specific, where you'll see those more out of the sideboard than in the main deck.
Okay, so that's red-white vehicles, and that leaves us green-blue. So this is energy ramp. And I guess that's because of cards like Attune with Ether, and you see Servant of the Conduit there that gives you mana of any color. What's going on with green-blue, Luis?
So it's trying to accumulate energy with a lot of the different commons in blue and green. Either Theorist, one of the best blue commons. A lot of the green cards give you energy. Spend it on cards like Thriving Rhino, Riparian Tiger. And then because it's so heavy green and it's a controlling deck, Wild Wander and Attune with Ether fit in so perfectly that the deck often splashes other colors. Prophetic Prism helps there too.
One of the things that we talk to viewers about when they're watching Limited Magic with a new set is where they should be looking. Is this a graveyard set? Is this a set where you can really tell what's going on by the colors of mana that are in play because everyone's trying to get to 4 and 5 colors or whatever it is? To what extent is this a format where keeping an eye on those energy counters is a big deal? Is energy pretty plentiful, or are people constantly scraping to get that one extra activation out of it?
It's very deck dependent, but there's definitely decks where when your opponent has like 6 energy, then you really have to be careful, because if they have a card like Multiform Wonder or Whirler Virtuoso, that 6 energy translates into a huge board advantage.
All right, so we worked our way through Blink with white-blue all the way to green-blue energy ramp. We hope that's marked your card for the drafts that you're doing at Friday Night Magic at your local store and, of course, on Magic Online. Those were the Kaladesh draft archetypes.